Hey, what's up, guys? You're now listening to Devo with Uncle Theo. Today is day 163, and we made it to another book. We're looking at the book of Esther today. And before we enter this book, I want to share two things with you about this book that I thought was very fascinating. One, if you studied this book, you know where I'm going with the first one. There's one word that's not even used once in the book of Esther. You know what that word is? It's God. God's name is not used even once in this book, not once, but he's very present. He's very active. And you get to see that in the book, even through the use of irony. And this teaches us a powerful lesson. A lot of times you may not see the hand of God visibly and explicitly, but he's very much at work. I know everybody's familiar with the Holocaust and the atrocities committed against the Jews, right? But when the Nazis had the Jews in concentration camps, guess what's the only book of the Bible that they forbade? The only book they weren't allowed to read. That's right. It's the book of Esther. See, even they understood what this book was about, that God invisibly has the power to overcome every enemy and every foe to keep his promise. They knew God fights for his people, and they feared this book because of that. So let's hop straight into it. Chapter 1, verse 1. Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. And so this Ahasuerus, another name for him is Xerxes. He's a king, but he's crazy and he's proud. And in fact, in verse 3 and 4, it says, in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes in attendance, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. So to speak to his pride and his craziness, they actually lost this battle and he's celebrating. And so he's a very wealthy king. But there are three things you need to know about Ahasuerus or Xerxes before we get started. One is he likes to drink. Two is he likes to be in control. And three, he's also a womanizer. And so you'll always see Xerxes drinking in this narrative. And ironically, he makes his best decisions drunk, which shows us another irony that when you're drunk, you don't have any control, which shows us the point. Who has the control? The person who is not mentioned in this book. God does. So the very beginning of this story is very chaotic. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And you have to read the opening chapters like that to know that it's chaotic so you can deal with the chaos well. But you have to remember that Xerxes likes to drink and we're in the middle of a banquet. Remember verse 4, and he's intoxicated and he insists on bringing out his wife. So let's look at that at verse 10. It says, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. The king became very angry and his wrath burned within him. And so there are a few positions that have flowed from this statement on what may have motivated her resistance or her rebellion. One is maybe she wanted to protect herself from the drunkards at this party. Two is maybe this was a lewd and wicked request because it said that she come out in her crown. And so some theologians have surmised that maybe this meant that he wanted her to come out in her crown only, without clothes, which would have put her in a very compromising position. Another position is maybe she didn't want to be in that moment because she was pregnant with Artaxerxes, who was the king during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah that we just looked at. And lastly, maybe she was just strong-willed and didn't want to participate. And in turn, that just embarrassed King Xerxes publicly. Or maybe it's a combination of the few, who knows? But I always like when theologians engage in what I call sanctified speculation. It just helps us try to put the pieces of the Bible together, but we can't put too much stock in those things. But it just helps us to deal with the narrative properly. But she rejects him. And when she rejects him, two things happen. One, we saw in verse 12, the king is very furious. And two, this is an interesting one. The people start to panic. It's almost like they're wondering if this will be the first rise of the feminist movement. Before feminism even happened, they're saying all the women will do this now. If she did this to the king, all the women will do this to us. So they push the king to establish an edict that cannot be repealed in verse 19. And guess what? He's drunk. So he does it. He establishes the edict. That's verse 19. It says, if it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come in the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. And so that's their position. Let's get rid of this woman. You see a little more of a flavor of it in verse 17. It says, for the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, and she did not come. And so obviously there's some truth to that. If this could happen at a high level with queen and king, women are going to quite naturally feel more comfortable to do this. So their point is well taken, but it seems like a bit of an overreaction, but we won't go too deep into that. But this sets the stage for Esther. So see how God is moving behind the scenes already? And so that moves us into chapter 2. The king's anger is subsided, but he's made this edict that he cannot reverse. And so verse 1 in chapter 2 says, after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. And they say, then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in Vashti's place. And this is how Esther comes on the scene. So basically, this is what they're about to do. They're about to have this glorified beauty pageant. So whatever comes to your mind, Miss America, whatever type of beauty pageant, they're getting women ready to bring forth to the king to replace Vashti. And so this is how Esther comes into play. Listen to this in verse 8. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young women were gathered to the citadel of Susa and to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace and to the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. It says, now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. And so you see the favor that she's receiving. Let's read verse 10. It says, Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem and learned how Esther was and how she fared. So we get the introduction of Mordecai and Esther. So to give you some backstory, verse 7 kind of gives that for us. It says that Mordecai took Esther in after her mother and father died, for Esther was Mordecai's uncle's daughter, which would make Esther his cousin. But since he's older and an elder, he basically took her in as a daughter. And that's how he treats her. He gives her counsel. He even tells her, don't reveal your ethnicity. And so thinking about our 12 tribes, if you can remember our study on those, Mordecai and Esther are from the tribe of Benjamin. Remember that, because that's going to be very important. I'm going to bring that back up and try to connect the dot for you. But if I do it well enough, it should blow your mind. But he tells her not to reveal her ethnicity, which is interesting. Now we see God's name is not mentioned. And now Mordecai is saying, don't even mention the name of our people. So what do you think about that for a biblical book? So Esther finds much favor in the eyes of the king's workers and the king. Verse 17 brings this home for us. It says, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And so we're setting the stage for something special to happen. And this chapter ends with an interesting story, by the way. Mordecai saves the king's life. So one day Mordecai was just sitting at the gate and he heard two men plotting about killing the king. And so he reports it back to Esther. Esther reports it back to the king in Mordecai's name. And they investigate it out and it proves, and it was written down, but mark that it's going to come back up too. It's going to be very interesting. And that moves us into chapter 3, where Haman is plotting against the Jews. In verse 1, it says, after these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But listen to this. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servant who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. And listen to this. For he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage, and he wanted to lay hands on Mordecai. And not only that, listen to this. This is where it gets demonic. Back to Genesis 3:15, the enmity between God's seed and Satan's seed. He doesn't just want to kill Haman. Look at what he wants to do in verse 6. Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now, can you see why this wasn't allowed to be read in concentration camps during the Holocaust? It was the desire for Haman to kill all of the Jews, which was the same desire for Hitler. And in this book, the plot does not succeed. But I wanted you to catch something. Haman is an Agagite. He is a descendant from King Agag. We have to go back all the way to Exodus. Remember Amalek, who was a descendant from Esau? See, Esau didn't hate Jacob, but his descendants really hated Jacob's descendants. And so in Exodus 17, God says, I will wipe them out. I will utterly destroy the Amalekite. And so later on, Saul had the opportunity to finish this. Remember when we were in 1 Samuel 15, but he doesn't do it. And because he doesn't do it, and that's when God took Saul's kingship from him. And so the story continues. Haman is a descendant of King Agag. He's an Agagite. That's where that name comes from. And that's the enmity between God and Satan. And that helps us with a great point. See, we didn't know at the time how critical not obeying God would be, but God knew. Hundreds of years before it happened, he knew that if you didn't utterly wipe out the Amalekites, they would try to destroy the Jews and the seed later. So God was telling his leaders at the time to cut that off at the head early before it gets to this point, but they didn't listen. And so now Haman is raised up and he wants to utterly destroy not just Mordecai, but all of the Jews. And I wanted you to see the beauty. I wanted you to see the beauty of the continuity of the Bible. A story from Exodus is tying in to 1 Samuel 15 and is tying in to Esther chapter 3. We are gaining some mastery of the Old Testament. Congratulations, guys. I'm proud of you. But let's remember, this is a book where God's name is not mentioned, but we are about to see God act mightily on behalf of his people. Talk about a behind the scenes God, a book where his name is never mentioned, but we'll see him probably operate more powerfully in this book than any other book where his name is mentioned several times. Looking forward to cracking all of this open with you. You guys take care. Catch you next time.